what does it mean to be burdened with glorious purpose? And one of the characters says, a lot more burden than glory.
When we look at the plot as the road for a story, characters are the reason we bother taking the trip.
I cannot stand to see his name on the page.
Hi, I'm Max.
I'm Drew.
And I'm Leisha.
Plot hole.
Said I'd write one chapter, wrote none.
I'm sorry, you do what?
I changed the ending again.
Rewriters.
Countless blueprints.
Infinite stories. And now, into the story.
What to you makes a story great? Generally speaking, like characters themselves make a story great, but like what does that mean to you?
I think when it comes to characters specifically and making a story great, to me, what makes a story great is the characters are overcoming something that maybe we don't necessarily experience. Like, we're not going to experience like slaying a dragon or whatever, right? But we are going to experience, things that are hard in our own life. And being able as a reader to understand that these difficulties are not things that I'm ever going to go through, but learning from the characters' experiences in overcoming them is probably one of the biggest reasons that I read stories.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that we often think of plot as a really important and central component of stories, which it is. However, I think when we look at the plot as the road for a story, characters are the reason we bother taking the trip. I think that when we take into consideration the importance of the experiences of the character, it brings to life the components that we put into the story, whether that's theme or mood or tone or whatever the case might be. It's all conveyed through a character's perspective. And I think, especially along those lines of, we may not get to slay dragons or cast spells or anything like that, but what we do understand is we understand, like, triumph, we understand loss, we understand, the sorrow and the joy that the characters often experience in some of our favorite stories of all time.
You guys hit like a lot of the great points about character. So I'll tell you that like in college, like character was a huge proponent of what we wrote. We talked about like character driven stories. There's also plot driven stories too. But I feel like the most effective stories kind of marry those two, right? Is sure you can have any interesting plot or whatever, but if they don't have a strong character behind it, it's not gonna really push it through. You can also have stories that have like the same plot but different characters that you really care about. The thought that comes to mind, of course, is like Harry Potter and Star Wars are kind of the same story. Orphan boy finds out he has magic powers and meets an old man who trains him to be stronger and defeat a Dark Lord. That's pretty much the exact same story at the end of the day. But if you ask me if Luke Skywalker and Harry Potter were interesting characters, I'd say yeah. Like, and you can describe them in different ways, and even though they may go through some of the similar story beats, like how they react to certain things, how they choose their path, the people they make their way with, like at the end of the day, those characters are their own, and that's what kind of, to me at least, even if plots tend to run the same hero's journey, or Leisha's talked in the past about like different plot devices for romance novels and such like that. Even if they follow the same story beats, an interesting character can take that and make it great.
I actually have an interesting follow-up question, and I'll pose this to Drew first. So this is kind of like a what came first, the chicken or the egg kind of question. Do you think the character should come first or the plot come first? Or at least what was your experience with your current story? Did you have the plot thought of first, or did you think of the characters first?
I definitely thought of the plot first, just because when I am first developing a story, I am thinking of the story in terms of just like overall arcing story, meaning like, oh, this series of events would be really cool. Let's design a story around that. So for me, it's definitely plot first. I rarely have a unique character idea. Actually, I did have a unique character idea this last week while listening to my wife read a children's book to my daughter. But I was like, oh, that's a really interesting concept for a character. And so I did some outlining for that book this week and then set it to the side. I put it in my write later folder. But that's the first time I've ever done that. The rest of the rest of my stories are circumstances that I think would be unique, and I developed a character that would fit into that.
For me, we talked about how I kind of went through a couple story iterations before I settled on what I'm working on right now. And lately, it's been kind of like the setting has been most important to me first, and then I'm trying to like fill that setting with a plot and people, which is kind of Tolkien-esque. You know, he came up with Middle Earth way before Frodo and the Ring. Like I've heard like original drafts of like The Hobbit didn't even have the ring. Gollum was just kind of the villain at the end there because of the way he created the world. Like his characters that filled that world became very important, and especially to him. Actually, Tolkien was famously hated metaphors, but his characters are kind of great because they all fill these kind of metaphorical roles for each other too. Which, granted, that's like a much later down the line thing for when you're writing a character. But I don't know. Maybe they do kind of fit in. I don't know. Do you guys have characters that are filling their personalities fill like an important role in the story to you? My main character in my story is he's kind of representing his entire world of being a little bit downtrodden, a little bit beaten down, trying to find the humor and the goodness in life through like kind of dry humor, you know. And that's kind of like a setting, and I wanted to tell that story through him. But do you guys have characters that you feel like are like that?
So actually, just to kind of answer the previous question and then also your question as well. The concept for the story that I'm writing, I actually came up with the character first. So my leading lady, so kind of just as a background, I have like been through therapy many times throughout my life. And every time I learn something new about myself, and oftentimes I actually find that a lot of these conversations help me kind of unpack things that I've kind of been through and help me learn how to cope moving forward, you know, when similar situations kind of come up. So this last year I was, you know, going through therapy once again. And it's funny because I've always felt like the same things come up over and over and over again each time. And I actually was talking to my therapist about a specific situation that had happened when I was much, much younger. And I had forgotten about it for many years. And then probably a couple of years ago, in the town that we lived in, there was some major flooding due to some like really heavy rain just in a really short period of time. So during that flood, for some reason, this memory popped back up into my head and I really struggled. I'm telling my therapist about this memory that I had and how it's kind of come up again and resurfaced, and I'm trying to figure out how to kind of work through it. And I kind of was sitting there with the idea a little bit later after the session, and I was like, that would make a really good tipping point for a character. And so I came up with my leading lady going through a very similar situation where, you know, she uncovers the fact that her home has completely flooded due to a burst pipe. And for some reason, it's like due to, you know, the situation, the smell, you know, what she's seeing, it reminds her of this memory from when she was a kid. And she finds herself completely at a loss and is not 100% sure how to work her way back from it. So for me, that was a really, really key component of me being able to develop the story. And so it's interesting that we all kind of have different focuses when it comes to how our stories have kind of come around. There is a really key component, and I can't talk about it quite yet, where my main character, her family is actually a really key component of this and shapes the setting in which a lot of the book is set in. My characters oftentimes are literally the entirety of the story. Like, they could be thrown in whatever setting, whatever plot, whatever situation. And I think that their personalities are the things that I want to make sure shine. So I think that that's my perspective and kind of what I've noticed about the characters that I've created thus far, and I really enjoy that.
I definitely feel like I have characters that are meant to fill specific roles. I don't necessarily know right now if my characters are metaphors for anything in my life or anything that I want people to think about or consider. But I definitely have characters that fill specific roles, right? I have characters that are definitely reflective of certain parts of my personality and how I would feel in certain situations. I mean, I feel like all of our characters, in a way, are a little bit a part of us or part of who we don't want to be or who we wish we were. And that's that's kind of the fun in writing characters, though, right? Is that it's not real, and so you're allowed to kind of play with those aspects a little bit. But Leisha, you brought up your therapy as an example, and in a way, going to therapy is character progression, right?
Mhm.
It's character growth, character development. And I wanted to ask you guys, what are some hallmarks that you've noticed in good books that you've read recently of like great character development?
I actually read a book really recently. It's obviously contemporary romance. Chelsea Curto, she writes this like hockey romance series, and
I knew you were gonna go here.
this has been like Max hates this.
No, it's not. It's not. I hate it. Okay, she just she read like 7 of her books in a week or something like that. Like,
Oh
anyway,
wow.
Yeah, I go through sometimes where I find like a trope or like a specific set of circumstances that I really like, and then I just binge it.
so hockey romance.
Hockey romance has been like at the top of my list for a while. But I think it's just because I really enjoy sports, and so I love like the technical aspect of sports being in books, and I think romance is such a fun thing to combine those two things. Anyway, in her book, The Hat Trick, I hope I don't bring up any spoilers if nobody's read it yet. So, in the book, the male main character, he actually gets into a really bad car accident and loses his leg, and
That seems like a big spoiler, but
yeah, it's pretty big. I mean, you could probably read it on the back of the book.
that's
It also
probably true.
you will also literally see the cover art is him with a prosthetic leg. Okay,
Okay, that's fair.
he loses his leg, and obviously, as a hockey player, that's pretty detrimental to his job. Like it completely alters, this guy who's traditionally seen as like a spot of sunshine, and takes him down a really really dark path. And while that's a really extreme case of like a circumstance where like you have a really good character that goes through something horrendous and it totally like throws them completely off track, the way that Chelsea handled, I think, the progression of him kind of coming back into himself through the female main character is his athletic trainer, and so she is a huge aspect and component of his rehabilitation, and in hopes that eventually he'll be able to get back on the ice. I loved that she was able to take this really, really horrible set of circumstances. In the preface, she talks about the research that she did into like athletes who are
Like paraplegic?
paraplegics or whatever the case might be, and like we have some incredible examples in other sports. When it comes to hockey, we have a very limited knowledge, and there was actually one that she had pointed out specifically that helped kind of inspire the story. But it's components of story of a character overcoming that kind of holding your breath, waiting for what's next, hoping and praying for them to pull through, that I think really like that's something that I truly love. So that's a character that came to mind immediately of like a character that I thought was very, very well written, that I saw so much development from, and she managed to make like him like the focal point in a way that honestly, I don't know, she just made him shine as a character.
It's not this one. My example is not from a book. It's from I finally finished Loki season 2 recently. I don't know if you've watched Loki, Drew.
I watched the first season. I got like I don't know, an episode or two into season 2 before I got distracted watching something else.
I will say, season 2 is not like, it's got a lot of filler. You really only need to watch like the last episode. But there's something about like how it ends, like that his character arc comes this like kind of full circle. Um, and at the end, he's giving himself to the rest of like the Marvel universe in a way that it's a big sacrifice for him, which is completely different from the first Loki we saw, in Thor and in Avengers, the first Avengers movie. Seeing him, because we know the history of this character, and he's had his ups and downs all along the way, but then in this TV show, like having him, like I'm trying not to spoil it, the ending. It's been a while, so I guess whatever. Just having him come full circle from the name of the last episode is Glorious Purpose. That's like the first thing he says in Avengers, that he's burdened with glorious purpose. And they ask this question during the final episode of what does it mean to be burdened with glorious purpose? And one of the characters says a lot more burden than glory at the end of the day. Great purpose is a lot more burden than glory. And that kind of like highlights exactly what the character growth was. And while like the season itself wasn't like 100% great, I also found myself distracted during several episodes, but the character growth itself really pulled me through to the end. And I think that's also kind of where a lot of stories go. Drew and I like to read like high fantasy stories where they're thousands of pages, and a lot of times like it's a little bit of homework, like
Yeah.
to read through. Like one of our favorites is like the Stormlight Archive, like the Way of Kings, and it's a project to read through it. And there's a lot of stuff where you're like, do we need to talk about that, blah, blah, blah. But the characters pull us through. And that's how I felt about that character growth of Loki, is that we've seen him in a lot of different things. And even in the not so great productions, the character survived that. And that's what kept pulling me through.
I think one of my favorite examples of character development is actually Zuko from Avatar.
Avatar?
Yeah.
Nice.
Dude, I love Zuko's story, man. Oh my gosh, it's so good. Because he falls prey to his weaknesses over and over and over and over again. His desire to please his father, to reunite his family, the reasons that he does all of those things in order to achieve that purpose, even though it's like an incredibly toxic situation that his family is in, is, oh my gosh, it's so good. It's one of my favorite examples of character development. But I also, because you brought up Loki, in a way, both, well, not in a way, they both are. Loki and Zuko are redemption stories. They're redemption arcs.
Which I'm a sucker for.
Yeah, I was about to ask, do you guys like redemption arcs in the antagonist of stories?
So this is an interesting question because it can be done really right and it can be done really wrong. I think in the case of Zuko, we learn that he's portrayed as the antagonist along the way. But we learn really who the real antagonist is in the final season, which is the Fire Lord at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Like, Zuko's father made him who he was, and Zuko chose to leave that and became a protagonist. That's a redemption arc I think works beautifully because it's not that Zuko was replaced as the antagonist. We realized he never was. He was just a boy trying to make the most of a situation and be the person who he assumed he needed to be before he figured out who he wanted to be. So I think that's a great example of something that's done really right with redemption arcs. A lot of times in recent media history that we try and make the villain sympathetic at all times that I don't love. I'm trying to think of an example of one. I feel like Thanos kind of like it just brought this kind of idea of making the sympathetic antagonist around.
I know one.
Okay, wait, you going? Go.
So I actually am gonna give this as a launch pad for Max because this is actually a redemption arc that he doesn't like. Kylo Ren.
Oh, okay. Wait, let me get on my high horse. Okay, all right. Let me put on my Star Wars cloak and pull out my lightsaber. Here's why I don't like Kylo Ren's redemption arc. It's not because he's redeemed. I actually love that he's redeemed because he has the opposite storyline to Anakin Skywalker. Anakin starts off not knowing he's good. He tries his best, and then through pain, he becomes dark again. Versus Kylo Ren gets this kind of like starts off, at least to us, she starts off bad and then slowly becomes good. And I actually do like his story arc there. The problem became I mean, part of the problem is that he died at the end. The problem became that it's like we're talking about I was talking about with Zuko about being him there was a real antagonist all along. The problem was that Kylo Ren never got replaced with like a satisfying antagonist. He wasn't able to show himself being redeemed in a satisfying way.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's a good example of someone I wish had a better is a good character who got kind of robbed by the plot, actually. Yeah, the plot wanted to be something and pushed his character out of the way.
I have mixed feelings about redemption arcs. The first example that kind of came to mind was Boromir. When I think about his specific kind of arc, even though it's very short-lived, like he makes a very human choice and error, and then obviously ultimately his sacrifice is what saves Frodo. And so I think it's hard to say because there's so many different examples that I think of when it comes to, I guess, popular media. Like I think of the Beast in Beauty and the Beast, Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, just like all these different characters that like a redemption arc is a key component of the plot. That's the whole purpose of them, kind of coming to a point where they're good. I find myself really loving when a villain is just evil. Like sometimes I think that it's good to have a character that doesn't actually ultimately end up growing, or sometimes even becomes worse as the story kind of continues. I think that sometimes when we see like those unredeemable characters, that it really like I don't know. I think part of it is just also like I've always been like a really big horror fan, and so that's generally what you're working with. Is you're working with an unredeemable monster a lot of the time. So I think there's definitely places for redemption arcs, and there are some great examples of redemption arcs that I think are done very well. But I think that we should also be okay if a character doesn't ultimately end up living up to our expectations.
So I recently finished watching Attack on Titan, and I really, really, really dislike the ending of that show.
From what I've heard, you're not alone.
Dude, oh my goodness. I actually wanted the primary protagonist to just full on lean into being the antagonist at the end and be like, "You know what? You know what? Screw it. Let's blow up this whole thing." Like I personally thought that would have been a more satisfying ending for me, because I feel like in a way his feelings are justified. If you haven't watched it, you should go watch it. It's a really great show. You might find the ending slightly disappointing, like I did. If not, good for you. But it was so frustrating to me, and I sometimes want. Okay, because that show at the end of the day, it's meant to be, in my mind at least, a tragedy. In the same way that Star Wars with the story of Anakin is meant to be a tragedy, right? And he is trying to overcome these feelings of wanting to join the dark side, and he has trained his entire life to do so. And then the moment comes where he can be like, you know what? I'm not going to fall victim to this. But he does. And that's the tragedy there. I sometimes wish that we would get more tragedies in stories, because I think those are actually better reflections of humanity. Is we as humans fail at the things that we, find whatever our weaknesses are all the time. We fall victim to them all the time. I wish that there were more tragic stories because those tragic stories feel more relatable to me. At least I don't know. What do you guys feel about? How do you guys feel about tragedies?
I love this. One of my favorite stories, and I've this like it's funny that this is one of my favorite stories of all time because it's so like not with anything else that I traditionally like. I love the story of Macbeth. Like I love
Theater kids everywhere just cringed
I know.
at the
I
name
know.
of the forbidden play.
I really love the story of Macbeth because like there is nothing ultimately redeemable. It's just tragic. Like what Macbeth finds himself going through. I genuinely think that I mean, and this is something that I've learned throughout all of my years of therapy, is we learn the most about ourselves when we're sad. And I think that there's something kind of poetic about that, especially when you take into consideration like the importance that tragedy, trauma, and adversity has in like some of the greatest stories of all time. Like we look at, just to kind of give like a really specific example on kind of a redemption arc, but also kind of just the strength of characters. I mean, we've talked about the Lord of the Rings many times, just in the last,
And we will continue to do
and we will
so.
continue to do so. I think of Samwise Gamgee, like who is such an incredibly strong character, and his development throughout the story is so consistent. He is unbelievably loyal, and that shows from the beginning to the end. And I think, there's a lot of tragedy like within, that story that while Frodo is kind of like the focus of it, I think that Sam is so underrated when it comes to the amount of strength that he contributed that got them ultimately to the end. Like obviously, like he ultimately ends up being the savior. You know what I mean? So yeah, I think there's an important component of tragedy that's required for us to, because I mean, obviously this is hilarious coming from a romance writer, like who loves a good happy ending and who wants to write them. Um, I love catharsis. Like I love when there's not really neatly tied up in a cute little bow ending to a story.
I was thinking about tragedies, and I'm wondering, like, do I write tragedies? Like, do I ever put a character in that really is truly just tragic? I can't think of one. I was reminded of Panic at the Disco. I write sins, not tragedies,
Mhm.
and I think that's kind of what my characters tend to be. If they're gonna be tragic in any way, it's that like gray area of the world. Like maybe what they're doing is not doing the wrong things for the right reason, or right things for the wrong reason, anywhere in between of that, which is, I think, a little bit tragic to readers in a way, like a kind of anti-hero aspect, which the world is really obsessed with right now. We live in the gray, and I think it's a pretty interesting world to explore. I am curious though about writing tragedies though. I wonder if I can have like truly tragic characters. Like that sounds like a fun project to be part of.
I think one of my favorite examples of a tragic character actually is from the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. If you've not read the books and you do want to, probably skip forward a little bit because I really want to talk about this character. This character is just so good for a tragedy, and I want to use them as an example, and I want to be kind of specific about it. So skip ahead if you don't want spoilers. But the character Moash in
Okay, all right. I was like, okay, I'm not sure if I know the answer to this question, but I know. Okay, continue.
Okay. Moash is such an incredibly good tragic character because him and the primary antagonist of The Way of Kings, Kaladin, are both people who have been wronged by upper class society, by nobles.
The protagonist.
Protagonist
Sorry,
Kaladin.
Protagonist Kaladin. Sorry, protagonist. Kaladin.
You're good.
They've both.
Whoa, what a spoiler!
I know, jeez, huh? they've both been wronged by nobility and the upper echelons of society in a way that is honestly like horrible and unforgivable and horrendous. And Kaladin decides to take the high road, forgiveness, work with these people, become a better person. Moash, on the other hand, is unable to get over over these issues that he has. And he turns from one of these characters that you love in the first book. He is Kaladin's right-hand man. They do all of this really awesome, super cool, incredible stuff together. And then by I think it's book 2, book 3, he decides that he cannot forgive them for what they did. And he actually ends up turning into an antagonist. And oh my gosh, Brandon Sanderson did such an amazing job with this character because every time I see his name pop up on the page, my blood boils. I cannot stand to see his name on the page, and I think that's the emotion, the reaction that Brandon was trying to get out of us, the readers. He wanted us to like hate this character. But why do we hate this character? Because he was unable to forgive somebody for something that they did to him and his family that was honestly horrific. I don't know if we really should be hating Moash as much as we do, but gosh, I can't stand him. So I actually really I really like tragedies where protagonists go from being good characters who are then unable to become better people and turn into antagonists. I love that so much.
I do feel like while it's like noble of us to think, oh, maybe like we should give Moash a break or something like that, I think readers don't like make that. It makes them so upset is because they see his potential and he's not realizing it, and that's a sign of a great character because you understand the character and then they understand themselves.
I mean, but something that I think is important to also keep in mind is like, especially when it comes to antagonists. Like, I'd love to take this tangent a little bit further. Okay, one of my favorite things is when I have an antagonist. The more that I get to learn about that antagonist, the more I think internally. Wow, it makes so much sense why they are the way they are. Like, I honestly, you go, Queen. Like, where it 100% makes sense why they are the way that they are. Is there anyone like a character that you guys have read about or one that's in media where they're a villain and you're like, you know what? I completely understand why you are the way you are.
Leisha and I love. Have you seen Castlevania, Drew?
I have not.
We had talked about it before. It's pretty. It's a pretty like gory and vulgar like anime. So it's not for everybody. But there's a character in Castlevania. His name is Saint Germain. And Saint Germain is like this character that's kind of introduced in kind of the middle of the story. He's kind of mysterious. You don't really know who he is. And then he starts helping out like the main characters and getting along with them. And he's really like a key aspect of it. And then he twists at the end. He's, basically like it seems like he's like kind of like a pawn for the main villain of the story. But what he's really trying to do at the end of the day is just trying to save his wife who was lost, or the person who he loved who was lost. That's like a good example of like both a tragedy and kind of hidden antagonist who you understood at the end, like, man, like he really was just trying to do everything he could to get her back. In the end, he has a little bit of redemption too, which is nice, but he was a great character for me, at least, that like he was really just trying to be a good guy. He was trying to do something for himself, which in the end of the day may be selfish, but it was understandable.
I found my character, Drew, if you need some more time.
Yeah.
So the villain that kind of comes to mind that meets this like thing for me is Killmonger from Black Panther. I mean, mind you, when I first watched Black Panther and we were introduced to Killmonger, I was like, come on, dude. Like, get over it. But then the more that I kind of started to think about it, I was like, when I started to think about everything that he had kind of been through in his life, and obviously being a black man in America is very different than, what T'Challa experienced. So I had to look up what he says when guys, bury me in the ocean with my ancestors who jumped from ships because they knew death was better than bondage. He's driven by the systemic injustice and historical trauma that not only he's experienced, but that he acknowledges that his people have experienced. And so, to me, his rage isn't madness, it's grief turned militant. And so I think sometimes we see characters like that whose grief and, unwillingness to forgive, unwillingness to move forward on the high road, per se, makes for a very compelling villain, a villain that you can understand.
No, dang, I don't really have somebody that I can like think of off the top of my head. I mean, I know there are a lot of them, but I don't know.
Well, so why don't we move on from antagonists? Because I know Leisha's not writing a story where
There's antagonists.
antagonists are not really, unless you talk about, I don't know, the ex-boyfriend or something like that. I don't know.
It's more of a trial, like
The
self versus
antagonist
self
is
kind of
the circumstances or something.
Yeah. So this is Professor Max with English with Creative Writing 101. You have a lot of different kinds of stories when it comes to basically the conflict. You can have character versus self, which is kind of a lot more like what romance does. And I think at the end of the day, a really good character kind of always has this in them. Not necessarily the driving force of the story, but a good character arc has character versus self. There's character versus environment. That's often things like, I don't know, like Twister or like San Andreas or something like that, where it's like a natural disaster is happening and they're trying to. The plot is basically, how do we survive? Because you can't really fight nature at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And then character versus character, which is where the antagonists come in and everything too. Those are like the big three. I can't think of it anymore off the top of my head. But I'm curious though, to move on a little bit from that. Characters grow through the refiner's fire, right? Purifying them by heating them up, cooling them down, heating them up, cooling them down. What are some of your guys' favorite ways to put your characters through that refiner's fire? When you guys are writing your characters, what's your goals when you're trying to give them kind of conflict and put obstacles in their path?
Personally, I really like to test my characters through nuance. And what I mean by that is have a character who has a belief system, and in their own mind, because they've not experienced anything like that, they have this specific belief system. They see the world through a black and white lens in that moment until they experience something like it, where they have to make a decision that is different from their belief system because they have to change in order to get the outcome that they want. That's probably one of the biggest ways that I enjoy showing character growth, is having them realize like, ooh, okay, this is actually not always black and white like I grew up being taught, or like I had this mentality because of something that happened earlier in my life when I was a kid and I didn't fully understand it. I really enjoy using nuance and conversations with like a mentor figure, where the mentor figure is like, oh, well, it's actually not that simple, and then the other character, and then your main character is like, oh, but it is that simple, and then they go out on a mission or something, and the character is like, ah, crap, this is actually not as simple as I literally told my mentor 2 chapters earlier that it would be. And then they apply the things that the mentor figure taught them or showed them, and then they have a growth moment there. That's one of the bigger ways that I really enjoy to show character growth.
Proving your characters wrong is pretty fun.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like Max mentioned, in the realm of romance, I don't have, like, at least I don't, I don't have like a Lady Tremaine or like, like any major antagonist in my stories. I think the device that I use the most when it comes to like refining my characters throughout the exposition of the plot is fear. I use fear big time because I think that that's something that is a huge contributor for many of us to the things that we experience, when it comes to adversity, especially in the realm of romance. Like there's a lot of fear in association with intimacy and, being vulnerable with someone that you are romantically inclined toward, Like, we're all married, and many, I'm sure people have at least experienced one instance of being in a romantic relationship where there was a lot at stake. There's always a lot at stake when it comes to us personally, and that's not even taking into consideration like the things that add value and weight to our relationships, kids, finances, values, the ways that you've grown together. So fear is a huge device that I utilize, and a lot of the time, like what not only allows that specific character who's dealing with the fear to grow, but that I use it as a way to bring the two characters closer together is overcoming their fears.
I think fears are great, actually. That's I definitely present in my stories too. I think putting my characters, giving them choices where the outcomes are there's the good, better, best choices. There's the bad, worst choices too. Also the choices where it's like this is good for somebody else, but not good for me. At least like, upon initial thought. And I think that's kind of where I put my characters in. I give them those choices where for example, like my character, like part of the plot is he's gonna be he's hired by a corrupt by a corrupt political figure to basically get some information for him so that he can bury some secrets. But of course, in order to do that, he's kind of uncovering the secrets along the way, and he asks himself, "Do I, do what's right for my clan so that I can maintain my freedom, maintain, the things that I want to do in my life, or do I expose this so that I can, protect other people, or can I expose this?" And that's all these questions. I think that's where I like to live in that kind of what like I want my characters to question just as much my readers. I want them to look at it and say, what is the right choice? And then form their own opinions on what the right choice is. And if the characters make the choices that the character, I set up the character to make, if that's like believable and understandable, I want them to, even question it and say, hey, is that really what the character would have chosen? I think that's kind of a fun experiment too, to just make it, and you make a character that is believable enough that when they make a difficult choice, it's understandable, whether or not you like the choice.
Mm-hmm. Let me throw another question into the pot. So, something that I want to ask you guys, because my hope is that there are some aspiring writers out there. What was it, 81%?
Yeah.
People want to write a book?
Yeah.
Let's make it 82%. Yeah.
My hope is that there's people out there that are really wanting to tell a story, even if it's their story. With that in mind, something that I wanted to ask you guys to kind of give a little bit of advice about is, what is one trick or tip you'd give a writer who wants to level up their characters?
I would say a piece of advice that I would give to people that want to level up their characters is give your side characters their own motivations and purposes, and have them be occasionally at odds with your main protagonist. I've read so many stories, even published stories, where side characters just kind of seem to be plot devices to like help the main character along, and they have no desires or wishes of their own. I would definitely say, like, even use that as a plot device to be like, hey, I actually want this other thing that the primary protagonist doesn't want, and have them overcome that together, if they can, or if not, have them be at odds to each other. I think having your characters disagree because they all want different things adds so much depth to a story.
I love side characters. We were talking about this earlier. Just about side characters are just awesome if you do them right. I think like if you don't give them like their own story, are they really characters at the end of the day, or are they just plot devices? That's like a trope that you do want to avoid when you're writing. Maybe that's my tip for leveling up your characters: is make sure they're characters. Give them their own backstories and, like Drew said, their own motives and everything. Just about everyone that your characters interact with. I really liked when in my first chapter I wrote that I had showed Leisha and Drew, the police officer who brings in this guy and the officer who's like looking him have this interaction where like it shows it that they're kind of corrupt. Like they're trying to get preferential treatment to I don't want to have to go uptown. I want to be able to just dump him here. Can we just like what's it gonna take? And the person booking him was like, yeah, just give me the drugs that you found on him. And then you're like, whoa, like that's like way corrupt and everything. But like that created a character moment, for these characters who we may never interact with ever again. But like that's what I liked about like Game of Thrones too, is like Game of Thrones, like every character had a name and had a family and had a story. And that's I think its strongest point, and I think that's probably how you level up your characters a lot, is making sure everyone's got a name and has a story. It doesn't have to be a huge long story, but maybe where did they come from? Ask that question. And what are they doing? What is their goals?
I think something that I've been really loving in characters that I've been reading about, as well as something that I'm hoping to be able to apply to, if not, the two characters that I have in mind currently, maybe some characters in the future, is give your characters a lie to believe and then let them find out that they're wrong. I think that when it comes to the development of a character, I think that oftentimes, like, I think about the rumination, the things that we often like lie awake thinking about at night, and how there have been sometimes the best ideas or kind of like eureka moments that I've had, sometimes like in the most innocuous of situations. I think this week we were talking about how the shower and the toilet are like two places that are rife with like
I call it shower revelation and toilet revelation, just getting those great ideas in like the most mundane of places.
Right. I think that by giving your characters an opportunity to not only believe in a lie, like like to believe, whether it's something about themselves or something about a situation. I mean, I think Zuko is honestly such an incredible example of this, because like the entirety of the time, like he thinks that he'll earn his honor, by honoring his father, but then he realizes that his honor was his to defend. So I think that we allow our characters to really come alive when they acknowledge that they're flawed. So I think that would be a really key component of leveling up a good character.
Hey, so weekly word count. How do we do this week?
So I got to about 812 words done. I didn't get to do as much as I wanted to, mostly because I've been really trying to figure out the correspondence aspect, because there's a lot of this book that happens over email and forums and text conversations and that kind of thing. So I'm trying to kind of map that out a little bit. So as far as actual storytelling, 812.
I'll go next. I got about 476 done. Mostly this week has been trying to figure out the magic system, and that is what I accomplished. Like I had the kind of basis of it for a while, and I've been toying with a little bit, but I didn't. It was a pretty soft magic system, and I was trying really hard to get it to a more concrete space where I could actually use it in the story. And I got to that space this week, so not as many words, but a big accomplishment for that going forward.
So this week I wrote 722 words. I don't know. I was feeling really stuck on the part of the story that I got to. Like I got through the first 5 chapters or so, and I was feeling really good about those chapters, and then I don't know. I was feeling really stuck. Like I knew more or less how I wanted the story to continue, but I don't know. I just was feeling so blocked, and so I decided to take a page out of Leisha's writing book, and I just wrote a chapter that I wanted later in the book that I don't necessarily know exactly where it's going to be. And so I started that chapter, and I am like really happy with it actually.
I keep getting that advice from other people too, and to just write where you want to write. So I don't know. I might give it a shot sometime.
It just was nice because I was like, I know how I want the story to progress, but I like my fingers are not putting the words on the page. But there's this other chapter that I know how I want to write, and I know that it's going to be in this same book, and in the future I'm just going to write that because I got to get some writing done today. I got to get like this book's got to move forward in some capacity. So I went and started working on that other chapter, and it actually like flowed really well. I really enjoyed it.
It's so funny that you said that because I've been actually trying to write more chronologically lately. So I feel like that's why my progress is stunted a little bit, just because
is this Freaky Friday?
I know. So just I'm trying because I know the ideas that I can always go back to it and like I'll be able to figure it out eventually. But part of me is just like I want to reward myself with like really like when I know that something's gonna flow, let me get through this hard part first, and I can reward myself with the free flow of chapter I'm really wanting to get to happen.
Alrighty, sounds like we got our
We got our work cut out for us
mandates.
this next week.
Exactly, yes, and let's keep going. And thank you all for listening, and let's get back into the story.